Good afternoon and welcome to this session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, or this evening for those of us who are in Europe, will feature discussion of Dr. Gary Gerstle's book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era. With the author and with commentators, Drs. Elizabeth Cohen and Christina Schor. A warm welcome to the three of you to the Washington History Seminar. In fact, to Liz and Christina, I'd say welcome back. Great to have you back to the Washington History Seminar. I'm Christian Osterman. I direct the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program, and I have the pleasure to co-chair the seminar series with Eric Arneson of the National History Center and George Washington University. Today, Eric will introduce our speakers and moderate the discussion. The Washington History Seminar is a collaborative effort of two organizations, the National History Center of the American Historical Association and the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program. For well more than a decade, the seminar has served as a nonpartisan forum to discuss important new historical findings, insights, and publications, something that's central to the mission of both of our organizations. Behind the scenes, there are two individuals who helped produce this event, Rachel Wheatley for the National History Center and Pete Bierstecker for the Wilson Center. Our thanks to both of them. We'd like to acknowledge our supporters, and we welcome your support. Details on how to support this seminar, which both of our organizations are basically doing pro bono. Details on how to support the seminar are available now in the chat, or simply go to our institutional websites. Finally, please join us next week for a session on Mary Barton's book, Counterterrorism Between the Wars. A couple of technical notes before I turn the Zoom room over to Eric. Today's session will be recorded and will soon appear on our respective organizations' websites. For the Q&A part of this webinar, you have two ways of joining the discussion. We ask you, and that's our preferred way, to use the raise hand function in the Zoom functionality. If you'd like to ask a question, once you press the button, you will be entered into a queue. When the moderator calls on you, you will receive a prompt, and that will ask you to unmute your screen. Please press yes, or you won't be able to talk. You can start getting in line even before the end of the discussion period. You can also use the Q&A function in the Zoom functionality and post your comment or question, and then Eric will put it to our speakers. Please do not use the chat function to communicate your questions or comments. And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. Looking very much forward to this discussion here today. Eric, over to you.
Thank you, Christian. It is my pleasure this afternoon to introduce our principal speaker, Gary Gerstle, the Mellon Professor of American History Emeritus and the Mellon Director of Research at the University of Cambridge. He is the author and editor of more than 10 books, including 2 prize winners, American Crucible, Race and Nation in the 20th Century, published in 2001, revised and expanded in 2017, and Liberty and Coercion, The Paradox of American Government from the Founding to the Present, published in 2015. His influential co-edited collection of essays, The Rise and Fall of the New Deal Order, 1930 to 1980, published in 1989, is still in print. Gary Gerstle is a Guardian columnist and has also written for the Atlantic Monthly, the New Statesman, Dissent, and The Nation, amongst other outlets. He frequently appears on BBC Radio 4, BBC World Service, Talking Politics, and NPR. He received his PhD from Harvard University and his BA from Brown University. And today he will be speaking on his newest book, The Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order, America and the World in the Free Market Era, published by Oxford University Press, I believe, just over a week or so ago. And with that, Gary, welcome to the Washington History Seminar again. The Zoom screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. Everyone can hear me loud and clear. I want to thank the Washington History Center and the Wilson Center for this opportunity. I want to thank Eric and Christian in particular, and the behind-the-scenes logistics people for handling this in so effective a manner. And I also want to thank Liz and Christina for taking time to read the book and offer me and you their comments. The book is new. It was only published last Tuesday, so just a week out. My assumption is that most of you have not read this book, and that informs the comments I'm going to give today, because I need to give you a sense of what the book is about. I'm not going to do much with the narrative or particular events. I think it's more important for me to give you a sense of the kind of interventions that I hope the book will make in debates about recent American history. At one level, this is a narrative history of the last 90 years from the perspective of national politics. 2 chapters at the beginning briefly recapitulate the rise and fall of the New Deal order from the 1930s to the 1970s. And then 6 chapters tell the story of the rise and fall of the neoliberal order from the 1970s to the 2010s up until the present day. I was still writing the end of the final chapter in January. That's 3 months ago. The book really goes through the first year of the Biden administration. As to whether it's advisable for a historian to come up so close to the present, that's another matter which we may want to take up later during discussion. At another level, the book seeks to make a series of interventions in the interpretation of recent American history, and it is on these interventions that I want to focus my comments. I want to highlight 3 interventions in particular. First, it substitutes a focus on political orders for a focus on 2, 4, and 6-year election cycles in the writing of American political history. Secondly, it substitutes neoliberalism for conservatism as the better term, not the perfect term, but the better term for talking about the era of free markets in American politics and political economy from the 1980s to the 2010s. And finally, it stresses international politics more than domestic politics for understanding the transition of neoliberalism from political movement to political order in the 1990s. And I want to take my time to illustrate and make comments on each of the interventions that my book seeks to make. The phrase political order is meant to connote a constellation of ideologies, policies, and constituencies that shape American politics in ways that endure beyond the 2, 4, and 6-year election cycles. In the last 100 years, America, I argue, has had 2 political orders: the New Deal order that arose in the 1930s and 40s, crested in the 1950s and 60s, and fell in the 1970s. And the neoliberal order that arose in the 1970s and 80s, crested in the 1990s and 2000s, and fell in the 2010s. At the heart of each of these political orders stood, I argue, a distinctive program of political economy. The New Deal order was founded on the conviction that capitalism, left to its own devices, spelled economic disaster. It had to be managed by a strong central state, able to govern the economic system in the public interest. The neoliberal order, by contrast, was grounded in the belief that market forces had to be liberated from government regulatory controls that were stymieing growth, innovation, and freedom. The architects of the neoliberal order set out in the 1980s and 1990s to dismantle everything that the New Deal order had built across its 40-year span. Now, the neoliberal order, too, I would argue, is being dismantled. Establishing a political order demands far more than winning an election or 2. It requires deep-pocketed donors to invest in promising candidates over the long term, the establishment of think tanks and policy networks to turn political ideas into actionable programs, a rising political party able to consistently win over multiple electoral constituencies, a capacity to shape political opinion both at the highest levels, like the Supreme Court, and across popular print and broadcast media, and a moral perspective able to inspire voters with visions of the good life. Political orders, in other words, are complex projects that require advances over a broad front. The new ones do not arise very often. Usually they appear when an older order founders amid an economic crisis that then precipitates a governing crisis. Stagflation precipitated the fall of the New Deal order in the 1970s. The Great Recession of 2008-2009 triggered the fracturing of the neoliberal order in the 2010s. The key attribute of a political order is the ability of its ideologically dominant party to bend the opposition party to its will. Bending of this sort comes to be perceived as necessary within the ranks of politicians competing for the top prizes in American politics, the presidency and control of Congress. Thus, the Republican Party of Dwight D. Eisenhower acquiesced to the core principles of the New Deal order in the 1950s, and the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton accepted the central principles of the neoliberal order in the 1990s. Acceptance is never complete. There are always points of tension and vulnerability in a polity as vociferous as the American one. And yet the success of a political order depends on its proficiency in shaping what broad majorities of elected officials and voters on both sides of the partisan divide regard as politically possible and desirable. By the same token, losing the capacity to exercise ideological hegemony signals a political order's decline. In these moments of decline, political ideas and programs formerly regarded as radical, heterodox, or unworkable, or dismissed as the product of the overheated imagination of fringe groups on the right and left, are able to move from the margins into the mainstream. This happened in the 1970s when the breakup of the New Deal order allowed long scorned neoliberal ideas for reorganizing the economy to take root. It happened again in the 2010s when the coming apart of the neoliberal order opened up space for Trump-style authoritarianism and Bernie Sanders-style socialism to flourish. My second intervention is an important one. It's in the title of the book. And that is substituting the term neoliberalism for conservatism. Conservatism, of course, has long been the preferred term to frame the political developments that are at the heart of my book. Why then label the political order that dominated America in the late 20th century and early 21st centuries a neoliberal one rather than a conservative one? That choice deserves some explanation. Conservatism in the classical sense signifies respect for tradition, deference to existing institutions and the hierarchies that structure them, and suspicion of change. One can find manifestations of these ideas in American politics across the second half of the 20th century, most importantly in a widespread determination among white Southerners to maintain racial privilege in the era of civil rights, and among Americans throughout the country, who in the name of tradition were pushing back against liberation movements, calling for equal rights for women and gays and for sexual freedom. Other beliefs commonly associated with conservatism in America, however, do not fit comfortably under this political label. A celebration of free market capitalism, entrepreneurialism, and economic risk-taking was central to Republican Party politics of the late 20th century. Yet this politics was not about maintaining tradition or the institutions that buttressed it. Rather, it was about disrupting traditions and upending institutions that stood in the way. Neoliberalism is a creed that calls explicitly for unleashing capitalism's power. Invoking this term allows us to shift the focus of political history in the last third of America's 20th century, somewhat away from white Southerners and family patriarchs resisting change, to venture capitalists, Wall Street modernizers, and information technology pioneers seeking to push change forward. That shift in emphasis, I argue, is long overdue. Central to the politics of the Clinton years were major legislative packages that fundamentally restructured America's information, communication, and financial systems, and whose influence on 21st century political economy has been decisive. And yet those restructurings have attracted less attention than they deserve, their significance hidden by the smoke generated by the decades' fiery culture wars. Those culture wars cannot be ignored any more than the racial backlash against the civil rights movement can be slighted. But it is time to bring the project of economic transformation more into focus, to give it the kind of careful examination it deserves, and to adjust our views of late 20th century America accordingly. A focus on neoliberalism can help us do that. Neoliberalism is a creed that prizes free trade and the free movement of capital, goods, and people. It celebrates deregulation as an economic good that results when governments can no longer interfere with the operation of markets. It valorizes cosmopolitanism as a cultural achievement, the product of open borders and the consequent voluntary mixing of large numbers of diverse peoples. It hails globalization as a win-win position that both enriches the West while also bringing an unprecedented level of prosperity to the rest of the world. These creedal principles deeply shaped American politics during the heyday of the neoliberal order. Neoliberalism, I argue, sought to infuse political economy with the principles of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism discerned in markets extraordinary dynamism and possibilities for generating trade, wealth, and a rising standard of living. It sought to liberate markets from encumbrances, monarchy, materialism, bureaucracy, artificial borders, and tariffs. It sought, in other words, to release the economy from the heavy hand of the state in its various guises. It wanted to allow people to move around in pursuit of self-interest and fortune, to truck, barter, and trade as they saw fit. Classical liberalism wanted to let individual talent rise or fall to its natural level. It carried within it emancipatory, even utopian hopes of people freed and a world transformed. Now, my interpretation of neoliberalism is somewhat different than that of other scholars who deploy the term. And I don't want to get into the weeds here. We can do that during the discussion if you wish, except to say this. One common interpretation is that neoliberalism is elite-driven. It's a project by elites to contain and undermine and eviscerate the democratic aspirations of the people. There is definitely an important elite component to neoliberalism that my book amply documents. But I also argue that focusing simply on an elite model of neoliberalism is not sufficient to account for this creed's popularity and its authority. Neoliberalism in America was able to fasten on to the promise of America as a land of freedom, individuality, and reinvention. It was profoundly appealing to Americans on high and Americans down low. It was profoundly appealing, I even argue, to those on the left or the new left, as well as those on the right. Thus, if we discern in neoliberalism an elite component, we also must reckon with its popular component. Ronald Reagan told Americans that freedom was their birthright. It was the reason the American Revolution was fought. It was the reason their nation had come into being. And many, many Americans believed him and invested in that message. My third intervention has to do with the international dimension of politics during the moment of transition, when neoliberalism went from a political movement to a political order. And one international event loomed over all the others. and that was the fall of the Soviet Union, and more broadly, the fall of communism. Theodore Draper, once a communist and then a devout anti-communist and a writer on American politics and American history, once said that the 20th century was the communist century. And I think he was right to do so. And what he meant by that is that there was no more important event in the 20th century than the Russian Revolution of 1917. The threat posed by communism to capitalism was severe. Where communism established itself, capitalism was expelled and the property of capitalists expropriated. The theory of totalitarianism, which became dominant from the mid-30s to the mid-60s, said that wherever communism was successful in establishing itself, it could never be eliminated. Its presence would be permanent. This theory turned out to be wrong. But what matters here is not whether it was right or wrong, but how intensely it was believed by American policymakers and by American capitalists. And the threat of communism, both in the world in terms of removing markets from capitalist accessibility, and also in America, when the labor movement was on the rise in the 1930s and 40s, the fear of communism inclined capitalists to compromise with labor to avert the worst. And in the book, I talk about the grand compromise between capital and labor. That was the signal achievement of the New Deal order. The labor movement was strongest during the years of the Cold War. The welfare state, with all its limitations in America, reached its apogee when the Cold War was at its height. And this was also the era in which economic inequality in America reached its nadir. Once communism was gone, the imperative to compromise vanished. Once communism was gone, capitalism could become global in a way it had not been since prior to the First World War. This was the moment when neoliberalism went from political movement to political order. My argument about communism is not a defense of communism. It was an indefensible system of tyranny. But saying that it was an indefensible system of tyranny does not excuse us from grappling with its historical role across the 20th century. And that's my third intervention. The neoliberal order crested and then cracked under George W. Bush. My chapter on the Bush years is called Hubris. Bush and his administration tried to apply neoliberal principles everywhere, including reconstructing Iraq and solving the problem of racial inequality in the United States. His actions led to the financial crash of 2008, 2009, exposed the promise of globalization and neoliberalism for the fiction it was, and triggered a decade of political turmoil when the neoliberal order came apart, allowing two political figures utterly marginal and inconsequential in American politics in the 1990s. I'm thinking of Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, to become, in the second decade of the 21st century, the most dynamic and convulsive figures in American politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much. A word to those in the audience about the question and answer, as Christian pointed out at the beginning. If you wish to participate and pose a question or brief comment, you can do so by using the raise hand function. That allows me to call on you and you get to ask the question, or you can use the Q&A function in Zoom, in which case I get to ask your question for you. And with that, let me introduce our first discussant this afternoon. Elizabeth Cohen is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor of American Studies and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor in Harvard's History Department. She's the author, most recently, of Saving America's Cities, Ed Logue and the Struggle to Renew Urban America in the Suburban Age, published in 2019, which won the 2020 Bancroft Prize, And back when we were in person, we did a session at the Washington History Seminar on the book. Previous publications include A Consumer's Republic, The Politics of Mass Consumption in Post-War America, 2003, and Making a New Deal, Industrial Workers in Chicago, 1919 to 1939, published in 1990, which won the Bancroft Prize in 91. She was Dean of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard from 2011 to 2018, and her PhD is from the University of California at Berkeley and her AB from Princeton. And with that, Elizabeth, great to have you back. The screen's yours.
Thank you very much, Eric. And let me just start with congratulations to Gary for an incredibly impressive book. And I'd like to just take a few minutes to start to say why I think so. The rise and fall of the neoliberal order delivers what has, I would say, become the Gerstle brand. We can also see it in American Crucible, Race and Nation in the 20th Century, and Liberty and Coercion, the paradox of American government from the founding to the present. Like these earlier books, Rise and Fall of the Neoliberal Order is an ambitious reconceptualizing of a long period of US history based on a wide and insightful reading of mostly secondary sources, so much so that Gary's footnotes are a goldmine of historiography on a very broad range of issues. Rise and Fall, moreover, is written with great boldness and argumentation and clarity of prose, neither of which are easy to accomplish. Gary manages here as well to achieve something that I know is not easy to achieve, and that is combining his own distinctive analysis with the momentum of narrative, so that the book tells a very good, if sobering, story, while also presenting a longue durée conceptualization of a move in economic thought and political implementation from classical liberalism to the liberalism of the New Deal order, to the neoliberalism that took off in the 1970s and reigned uncontested until fairly recently, most notably since the Great Recession and then under President Trump's watch. Despite many vestiges of neoliberalism that still remain today, Gary tells us that we seem to be on the cusp of something different that will speak to the ethno-nationalism, populism on both the right and the left, antagonism to open borders for people and for goods, and the deep racial divisions of white backlash and Black Lives Matter. More specifically, there are many places in Gary's book where his overarching interrogation of liberalism in its various versions sheds new light on old issues. And I'm just going to name a couple that impressed me. The first is one that Gary just mentioned in his overview of the book, and that is that he argues that anti-communism and the Cold War served to prolong the life of the New Deal order, as Republicans who might otherwise have focused more intensively on dismantling it felt constrained by competition with the Soviet Union to preserve more of a social safety net. Only after the Cold War retreated could a neoliberal order take hold in both parties, Gary argues. I see this as a very helpful companion piece, if you will, to the Cold War civil rights argument that some progress on civil rights was made in the face of communist condemnation and the American effort to recruit allies and markets in the decolonizing developing world. And the second thing I'll point to, although it's not new to proclaim that the Iraqi war was a disaster, Gary treats the American reconstruction and occupation of Iraq as a failed neoliberal project, where the neoliberal playbook of such things as extensive privatization helped to doom the effort. And he persuasively compares that flawed undertaking to the occupation of Japan after World War II, where no such ambivalence about governmental authority undercut the effort. But I wouldn't be doing my job here today if I didn't raise some questions for Gary. So here goes. The first one is that for me, one of the most frustrating aspects of the neoliberal order and its proponents is the contradiction between, on the one hand, a rejection of a strong hand of government in the economic realm, whether expressed through deregulation, privatization, or refusal to play a mediator role between corporations and unions, and on the other hand, its determination to use government power to limit people's personal freedom in their private lives, whether legislating against abortion, against equal rights for gays and trans people, against a secular society with clear demarcations between church and state, or against tolerant and inclusionary schooling. You acknowledge, Gary, this morally intrusive aspect of neoliberalism, and you label it a neo-Victorian moral code or moral traditionalism. But I don't find in the book much discussion of how neoliberals themselves reconciled these contradictory attitudes and actions towards individual freedom. So can you tell us more? How much, for example, is this inconsistency due to the power of religion in the US, particularly evangelical Christianity, or what else may explain it? My second question is the following. One of the strengths of Gary's book is that people make this history. It is not just a genealogy of liberalism from its classical roots to its reinventions, but it's one where the ideas and actions of real people, whether they're politicians or policymakers or agitators, are responsible for these shifts. And hence we are introduced, for example, to Ronald Reagan, Milton Friedman, Bill Clinton, Robert Rubin, Robert Reich, Mikhail Gorbachev, and Bernie Sanders, among many others. What I see less discussed in the central neoliberal sections, more so than in the treatment of the New Deal order or even the current populist turn away from neoliberalism, is the popular base for this politics. How is it that large numbers of Republican and then Democratic voters supported the neoliberal order? Here, I would like to hear more about the impact of such things as, one might be the stagnation in wages that may have encouraged ordinary Americans to prioritize their interests as consumers over producers in surviving economically, so that low prices, even on imported goods that were produced offshore, appealed to them. Or how the shift to the IRA and 401k regimes of retirement benefits drew more and more Americans into becoming investors, to the point where today 56% of Americans own stock, complicating their calculus of what was in their economic interest. Put another way, and this returns to a point you made in your comments, to what extent and in what ways was neoliberalism an elite project or a broader societal one? And how did it succeed electronically as one or the other? And finally, I'd like to ask Gary how much of this story is uniquely American and how much was true of other Western industrial countries. Most of his book recounts the rise and fall of neoliberalism as based on factors closely linked to American politics, the American economy, and perhaps American distinctive cultural factors such as religiosity. But the UK had Thatcher's neoliberalism and then Brexit. France has had its own robust neoliberalism, followed now by the rise of right-wing ethno-nationalism and Sanders-like right-wing revolt, both so evident in yesterday's election. And even Scandinavian countries have backed away from their social democratic commitments. Meanwhile, Germany, despite its own history of neoliberalism, has preserved the powers of unions and recently elected a social democratic chancellor. So can you say more about US distinctiveness and or the transnational influences on this history? So I'm going to stop there and just thank you, Gary, for an incredibly enlightening book.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Gary, do you want to engage those questions? If you unmute first.
I can. I was expecting to hear from Christina first. Do you prefer I respond to them now? Or?
Sure, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Liz, for that excellent summary of the book, and also for these penetrating questions. I'm just thinking about how I can respond with a degree of economy that won't take up too much time, so we have time for more general conversation. The first question: how do I reconcile the free market aspects of the ideology with the willingness to intrude as much as the neo-Victorians have, or at some point were willing to do, into private life? Part of the interesting exercise of looking into neoliberals, or those who supported freeing market forces, was the worries that they themselves had about whether ordinary people would be able to sustain themselves in conditions of a free market economy, that they wouldn't give into excess regarding debt, sex, immediate gratification, perhaps lose discipline at work. In other words, they were alert to the problems that arose when a free market, the power of a free market economy was unleashed. And at some level, they were not sure that all individuals had the requisite discipline. The New Deal had an answer for this, which is you had to manage capitalism in the public interest, and you had to give people a certain level of security. And the neoliberals were unwilling to do any of that. And so they had to find alternative source of discipline, which they found in the family of a certain sort: patriarchal, male breadwinner, woman in the home, raising the children, heterosexual, of course, no homosexuality. In other words, they relied on the family to do the disciplining work and to generate the right kind of citizens who could succeed and flourish in a market economy. But then the question arises, what do you do when you see people failing to have these sorts of families, or wanting different kinds of families? And that's when other measures begin to become called for. Now, you focused in your question mostly on the intrusion into alternative family life, or ways of living that people were preferring. There's also, of course, the huge contradiction of America becoming a mass incarceration society during the free market era. And the way I deal with this is to recognize a tendency that's present not just in neoliberalism, but in classical liberalism itself, that there are times when authorities, including state authorities, might be called upon to limit the freedom of certain groups of individuals so that a market economy can flourish in the appropriate manner. With regard to African Americans, the notorious and awful discourse of the underclass arises during the neoliberal era as a way of defining people and individuals incapable of allegedly having the discipline necessary to flourish in a free market society, and hence the justification for removing millions of people from the possibility of market exchange. That's one of the meanings of mass incarceration. Classical liberalism also had the tradition of what was called ordered liberty. In order for liberty to flourish, it had to be ordered somehow, and certain individuals were thought to be lacking in the order necessary. Certain racial groups, but also women and children and certain immigrant groups. So there had long been a tradition of resorting to state action to bring the necessary order in order for market society to flourish. And this is a contradiction that is deep in liberalism, not just deep in neoliberalism. It is paradoxical. You have to order society in order to free market society forces, and it's very much present in the neoliberal era. There are fascinating sets of paradoxes in this regard that I try and make sense of, and they emerge from the concern that liberals and neoliberals have that not all individuals have the requisite discipline to flourish in market societies, and they're not going to be nourished by the right kind of families. This then becomes a justification for the state to step in. Much more could be said about that, of course. The popular base of politics and the turn toward the GOP. I think you're right. I don't do enough on the popular base, with one exception, and that is to involve the new left in the story of neoliberalism's rise. And this I expect to be a provocative and somewhat controversial point, and one that's going to be much debated. In the 1960s, what's striking to me is how similar at various moments are the critiques of the over-organized New Deal society are coming both from the new left and the new right. That society has become too organized, that it's become too bureaucratized, and that it's suffocating to the human spirit. And in the hands of the new left, this becomes a rationale for liberation movements to free the individual to be him or herself, and to free that individual from the way too powerful and way too oppressive forces, institutions in society. And those institutions were not just capitalist; they were capitalist, but they were also universities. They were also an excessively bureaucratic welfare state. They were also a New Deal state that had become too regulatory and too suffocating to the ability of individuals to be free. So this is the way in which ideologically neoliberalism comes to generate an appeal on the right and the left, and it has profound meaning in America because it's able to connect to much older notions of freedom, the frontier, leaving the organized society in order to be yourself, reinvent yourself. So I think this is one very important popular base. You raise a different rationale for the conversion of certain constituencies, and that is the changing material conditions of the economy, the spread of 401ks, people getting pensions, and then being made responsible for managing those pensions in the stock markets. This is part of a broader phenomenon of the financialization of American politics, the rise of the finance industry to a position of power and authority, and also the capacity to generate enormous amounts of revenue and profits. The amount of income, profit generated by this sector of the economy becomes enormous, and a lot of what they have to work with are the personal pensions of union members and others who are now working with 401ks. And I can't answer this question except to say that the involving many, many more people in these sorts of finances may well begin to affect how they think about their own politics, and may well begin to affect how they think about which party they will want to owe allegiance to. And you can imagine that a certain appeal from a Republican Party may begin to have effects on these people in that new way. And what you're suggesting in a way is that the rationale for the Reagan Democrats and the Southern evangelicals going over to the Republican Party lies not just in the race appeal that Reagan offered and the Republican Party offered, but that there is another component that has to do with the changing circumstances of life for ordinary people. I think to get at this most fully, one group that we might want to bring into the conversation much more deeply than we have until this time are small businesses and their importance in the American economy, a perennially understudied component of the American population, certainly very important in politics, certainly very important in the Republican Party. And if we developed a focus on that group and how small business begins to imagine itself in this financialized era of this new American economy, we may get closer to the very important issue that I think you're raising. One of the people doing very interesting work on this is Melinda Cooper, who recently published a piece in Dissent, and I think we can look for more work from her on this matter. Finally, is this a uniquely American phenomenon? The neoliberal ideas are birthed in Central Europe, in Vienna, for reasons that have to do with the crumbling Austro-Hungarian Empire that Quinn Slobodian, I think, has written about very effectively. But after that, the motor for this transformation, this ascent of these new political ideas, are centered in the United Kingdom, and they are centered in the United States. And there may be some way in which Anglo-American conceptions of liberty prove conducive to the development and advance of this sort of neoliberal thinking. And certainly the paired careers of Thatcher and Reagan and Clinton and Blair are really, really striking. The project of neoliberalism is always global. And eliminating communism from the world is a global project of the first order. So even though I'm focusing mostly on the United States, to bring the story of communism, its rise and fall into this, necessarily makes this an international story. The neoliberals themselves understand their project as a global one, and that in order for it to succeed, it has to succeed on an international level. The story I tell about Clinton being the Democratic Eisenhower, Margaret Thatcher told a similar story of Tony Blair herself in that respect. She was once asked in her later years after she was out of office what she considered to be her greatest accomplishment, and her two-word answer was Tony Blair, by which she meant she got Tony Blair to accept the principles of the neoliberal economy. So this is a global project. It's a global vision, and one has to bring to it an international perspective. And it goes, if the US and the UK are two cockpits for this, it goes well beyond this. It stretches to Latin America. The EU has very strong neoliberal components. And I'm not enough of an expert on Germany and France to help us understand why neoliberalism sinks deeper roots in France than it does in Germany. But maybe Christina will shed some light on that question. I think we have to understand this as a global philosophy that's going to be worked out in ways that are analogous and yet different in the various places in where this ideology penetrates. So we want to have a perspective that is, on the one hand, global, but that on the other hand understands that every country has distinctive features to its politics, so that when neoliberalism lands in that country, it may well have a different set of configurations. Thank you for those wonderful questions.
And thank you for that response. Our second commentator this afternoon is Christina Schor, professor of international history at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and a senior fellow at the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at SAIS Johns Hopkins University here in Washington, D.C. In 2018 to 2020, she was the inaugural Helmut Schmidt Distinguished Visiting Professor at SAIS, a unique position made possible by the generosity of the German Foreign Ministry and DAAD. She is a specialist in the international history of Germany since 1945 and is interested in questions of world order, diplomacy and strategy, and the practice of applied history. She's the author of a dozen books or edited volumes, and her most recent monograph, Post-Wall, Post-Square, Rebuilding the World After 1918, published by William Collins in 2019 in Yale University Press in 2020, was published along with a German and Spanish edition, and the German edition won a prestigious award for the best political science book published in Germany. I should also point out that recent book was a focus of a seminar for the Washington History Seminar here online. She is now working on a global history of the Arctic. Christina, welcome back.
Thank you, Eric, for this very kind introduction. And thank you both, Gary and Liz, for your wonderful presentations of the book. So I don't want to rehash too much about what has already been said and sort of enter really the conversation at this point, while picking out a few things that I found most compelling. I mean, I think it's a really wonderful, finely written, clear book with a very clear message, with wonderful frameworks. The definitions of what is meant by political order, what is meant by neoliberal, how it comes together. And let me start first by what I find most compelling when it comes to the American history and politics that this book is about before I move on to sort of the international plane. I found it really striking when we think about, of course, when we hear the word neoliberal and we think about free trade, economic movement, freedom of movement of people, of ideas, we think of digitization, all these kind of things. And I thought you brought it out very well again, also today, Gary, that it started out in some ways as a movement of ideas put forward by politicians in the 1970s. And of course, we have to think about this, I think, in the context of, post-Vietnam, the détente era, the collapse of Bretton Woods. Something had to happen. And of course, on a broader scale, we had a major structural change. We're moving from the period, of mass industry into more high-tech change in the industries across the world. We were dealing with North-South conflict. And of course, we also were moving to sort of services industries, plus then the rise, especially of the financial sector. And I remember the title of one edited book by Neil Ferguson, The Shock of the Global. And Helmut Schmidt also talked a lot about, this massive economic interdependence and how in some ways international politics is international development politics, international economy, all these kinds of things. And in some ways, these ideas from the United States came in as a front runner in its own way when it comes to this more laissez-faire, open trade aspect. Really the open markets and trying to get as many countries to join that as possible. And then I thought it was very interesting how you pointed out this paradox, how as this movement and ideas begins to be turned into politics under the Reagan presidency, that in some ways we get these sort of two moral aspects emerging. And that ties a little bit back also to what we see in the Thatcher era. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. You say on the one hand, to control this force of the market forces, the reduction of the government, the solidity in some ways is, with the family, with God, religion, these kind of traditional things on the one hand, and on the other hand, the emergence of, what later in the Brexit campaign got called, the people of the anywhere, the jet setters, this cosmopolitanism, liberalism in that sort of sense of how people look at sexuality, of gender, of color, of all these kind of things, and that we have these sort of two strands emerging at a time, although technically, of course, that government sees itself as, Republican, more conservative in its sense. And then as we move out of the Cold War era into the post-Cold War era under Clinton, we see the sort of consolidation where left and right almost find this sort of new consensus. You bring it out with the example Gingrich, Clinton. But of course, we can also look at this, in a European context in a sort of similar way, where social democrats take on these ideas of, the more extreme forms of free market also entering in Europe and in other parts of the world, especially also because, this freedom of movement of capital markets and so forth. So I think, that opening out to global trade as the communist societies open to the markets. We talk about the telecommunications act, we talk about the World Trade Organization. And we could also mention here, of course, under the Bush 41 presidency, NAFTA, APEC, different kinds of free trade areas. All that sort of emerges, gets institutionalized, becomes sort of mainstream. But then interestingly, And that I found also really compelling when I think of your last chapter, where for the first time has a first draft of history for Trump and moving then to Biden. This aspect how on the fringes of something that started out perhaps more on the right, and then it becomes mainstream, taken on by Democrats and Republicans, and then under these strong men, we get on the fringes with the Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, more on the left, and further on the right. It gets sort of eaten away. And I thought that was very interesting, what actually brings about this fall, what you call the neoliberal order, especially in the US context. So all that for the American story, and I'm not in that sense a domestic American expert. I found that really compelling. I think it hangs very well together, and it sends a very clear message how this could be read when we use this concept as an organizing force, if you so want. And I mean, for me personally, I sort of thought, I see, the name Koch, Robin Limbaugh, this business of what's happening with the news, how there's the rise of Fox News, the rise of CNN, all these sort of different things, this privatization that had so much impact also just in the last couple of years when I experienced America under the Trump presidency, under the lockdowns on the one hand, the sort of authoritarian tying it down, and on the other hand, Black Lives Matter, these big protests in Washington, all the while the White House has walled itself in with what to me seemed like, almost a Berlin Wall kind of fence. And that in some ways, perhaps I use as an opener to what is also very striking on the cover of your book. And that made me think once more about one of the smaller critiques I want to raise, how this book, or how one might situate it perhaps in the international context or raise other kinds of questions, because it has the Berlin Wall at the very top and the Mexican border fence at the bottom. And the last one, for me, makes completely sense in terms of that American story that you are telling, the fear now of immigration, putting up these fences. These fences are also described, I'd experienced in the United States Capitol. But the fall of the Berlin Wall raises, of course, this point where you write something back into the history that, for example, Adam Tooze had written out was crashed. He said we don't need to think so much about the end of the Cold War divide, and we have to think of an era between the collapse of Bretton Woods and the 2008 and 2009 crash. You say, no, actually, if we want to understand what you call the triumph of the neoliberal order, actually, the collapse of communism is really important, and you highlighted earlier again this aspect that, the neoliberals or conservatives, or however we want to call them, the Reaganites, they really wanted to destroy communism. And here I would like to ask and raise a few questions, because I'm sort of thinking, well, how do we really need to understand this, on the one hand, the Cold War era, where I would say, yes, absolutely, of course, the Soviet experiment is a very important experiment. It's a modernization project, it's an ideological project, but I'm wondering, is it the best way to pit against each other the terms communism versus capitalism, which is quite nice, you have two C's, but isn't actually, it's more complicated because it's actually the planned economy versus the free market economy of different forms. And one form is a neoliberal, but of course, Modell Deutschland, what Helmut Schmidt drove in the 1970s, and of course, what also in part drove that European economic integration project, is quite different from that laissez-faire American or even Thatcherite model. And on the other hand, if you think about the sort of political system, the one-party state, on the one hand, authoritarian, and on the other hand, liberal democracies, again, of different sorts, presidential democracies, parliamentary democracies, two-party systems, coalition, and so forth, where we have also difference between America and Europe. And that raises to me also the question whether to talk about a neoliberal order as a order, not just for the United States, but as you said, what you want to claim, that it has actually international impact, whether up to a point, it isn't quite an Anglophone perspective. In other words, if we look together at Reaganomics and the Reaganite project and the Thatcherite project, the Thatcherism and other ism, there's, of course, many similarities. And then we see it emerge sort of in the third, that third way we had talked about in Europe, under Social Democrats who took that on in the 1990s, whether you look at Blair or Gerhard Schröder, the Chancellor in Germany, or we look at then Clinton in the United States, where that becomes sort of the mainstream, taking on that sort of more laissez-faire economic perspective into the 1990s. However, I would ask, isn't it so that if we look at the developments in Europe in the 70s and 80s, the Franco-German tandem that drove the European Union project, yes, there is free trade, but there's a very strong social charter, as we see in the Maastricht Treaty, which is, of course, the one thing Britain did not sign up on. And actually, there is, in some ways, also more sort of a state interference when it comes to welfare policies, whether we look at, typically Scandinavian states, or whether we look at the Nordic states at large. And I'm thinking here also, for example, the current Finnish government is also a social democratic government. The current German government is a social democratic government. The Germans call it, the social market economy. It's not the same as neoliberalism. And of course, this was something that in the context of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Soviet wider empire, Thatcher wanted to import to Eastern Europe. She said shock therapy, Thatcherism, that's what, the Eastern Europeans should embrace. And it's perhaps also something that, the advisors from the United States in some ways, took as ideas, shock therapy, to Eastern Europe and to Russia. But of course, these things need to settle over time, and we have seen very different kind of economic models emerge also in that part of Europe as it has then later joined the EU. Although on the other hand, we have also seen, similar ethno-nationalist tendencies and rise of populism, as we have seen in the United States, also in some of these new democracies. But this leads me to another sort of wider point, if we sort of conceptualize and we think about the significance of this end of the Cold War, because you talk about the triumph of the neoliberal order. Well, as a European, I would already sort of think the triumph. On the one hand, one can, of course, explain that the Soviet Union simply collapsed for systemic problems. The plan just failed. The empire by imposition failed because actually those countries in the wider empire did not want to be there. And then you had a new Soviet leader. It wasn't so much the triumph just of the United States and its ideas, but what the people in those parts of the world wanted. And I think that that element of people power converted through electoral revolutions into new types of governance brings me to in some ways, the counter argument to yours. If yours is sort of the political economic model and the triumph, Francis Fukuyama would say, no, it was the universalization of democracy. It was the power of liberal democracy as the highest form of governance, and that those two together perhaps need to be seen as two strands around this moment of transformation that brings about, and then we could take a third explanatory term used by Krauthammer and later by Hal Brands, this unipolar moment, if we think about it in terms of world order. In other words, it is that combination that, when the people in Eastern Europe, they didn't just say, hello, we want neoliberalism. No, they wanted freedom of speech, free elections. That's what they were driving. And we saw the combination of political and economic liberalization. And of course, in the West, one saw this as something that, for example, in Germany had been tried and tested and come out well, the prosperity story in the post-45 world. So my question is, when we have Fukuyama, the end of history, or if you so want, universalization of democratization, your argument, triumph of neoliberalism, unipolar moment, in which way should we be looking at this? What would you make of this? And I would like to propose the following, and I looked at it from quite a different perspective because I was interested in what happens actually to these tectonic shifts. I would call, by bringing these things together, this is the post-wall order, which is where, the people that have in some ways taken their reins into their hands, they have taken on the democratization, and then they're taking different forms of capitalism, and then also in part because they join Western institutions, seek to consolidate those early young capitalist democracies. And yes, they do want the United States in, but very much as an empire by invitation in that old Cold War sense, if we think about security. And then on the other hand, because it wasn't just simply, I would argue, that the triumph of the West, although it looked like that, because also the Russians were saying, yeah, let's have democracy, let's have capitalism, because the Chinese always took their different exit. They stuck to authoritarianism, to one-party state, but they too opened to the market. So yes, I would agree, the international openness of the market, the World Trade Organization, to which the formerly closed societies and states opened up, that is definitely something that the Americans were driving forward. But I don't think, for example, that Clinton had, a great strategy. I think it evolved over time as he, especially international affairs, started to prioritize different elements. And on the other hand, we had particular developments in Europe which were not necessarily entirely in line with the United States, because once September 11 happens, America pushes also and Bush 43 for regime change policy. That to me has also quite a sort of forceful element from the top. He may be wanting to universalize all this neoliberal aspect, but it's also quite forceful from the top. And many Europeans did not want to go along with that. And in some ways, the European story is a somewhat different story. And I think that's why also now, in the context of the current war, although we see a Euro-Atlantic coming together, we also see how Europe takes particular solutions inside the bloc. And is really neoliberalism, if neoliberalism has these elements of free market, is that really disappearing, or is something very specific happening in the United States that up to a point is also quite exceptional because its location and the way, of course, it maneuvers in the world, as really one, if not the great power that projects power? That's what I would sort of like to put on the table. So just to frame it as two questions, how do you think, in your view, the neoliberal order ties in with these ideas of that we are now moving into perhaps a multipolar world? And how does it play with, these questions of Euro-Atlantic security cohesion? In other words, how does the fall of the neoliberal order tie in with that? On the other hand, America is seen as this empire by invitation because more countries, for example, want to join NATO.
Christina, thank you so much. Gary?
Well, there's a lot there. Let me try and be brief and do justice to your questions, Christina, so that we also have some time for others to come in and ask questions. I think there's a debate emerging now. Well, there are multiple debates emerging, but one of the debates that's emerging is to what extent is the 1970s the critical transition point, and to what extent is 1989 to 1991 a critical transition point. Certainly the abandonment of Bretton Woods in the 1970s and a set of financial changes and transformations associated with that are very, very important. And Adam Tooze sees the 70s as defining, and you're correct in saying that he diminishes the importance of the end of the Cold War. Just read a piece by Steve Kotkin in Foreign Affairs who makes a similar point, and not in Adam Tooze's terms of financialization, but more in terms of geopolitical shifts and the reemergence of what he calls ancient empires, China, Iran, and I guess he puts Russia in that category. He sees it more as an ancient empire rather than as a failed Soviet experiment. On the other hand, Fukuyama's on my side of this. I have to claim him for me because he writes in The End of History that with the passing of communism, which he locates with the end of the Cold War, the last universal alternative to liberal democracy passes from the world. And he considers that a decisive moment. That doesn't mean that there was no opposition to liberal democracy, but it was not universal. It would be Islamic, for example, or it would be sectoral. It would appeal to a region in the world, but not the entire world itself. But he sees liberal democracy as being universal in its aspirations, and he sees communism as being universal in its aspirations. And once communism passed from the world, the last serious alternative to liberal capitalism and liberal democracy passed from the world as well. Now, I think democracy is an element of neoliberalism, as it was of liberalism. When I write about, and this is where I think my tying of neoliberalism to the broader history of liberalism is important. Liberalism is an economic project. It is also a political project that has to do with rule of law, the sovereignty of the people over the territory they inhabit, representative assemblies, courts that can adjudicate disputes and have their decisions respected. So liberalism is not just political economy, it has a political component to it. And I would say the same is true of neoliberalism. So I would not treat neoliberalism and the surge for democracy in Eastern Europe as very different forces. I think they're bound up together. But I also think that once communism passes from the world, the ability for people to imagine a life outside capitalism diminishes radically. And that makes a difference in terms of how the left is going to constitute itself after 1989 and 1991, not just in America, but in Europe as well. And it's also the 1990s become a period when the social democratic regimes of Europe, Western Europe, and Northern Europe accommodate themselves much more to market principles than they had done previously. And so I do consider 89 to 91 to be a decisive moment. Also, the reconstitution of the left in the United States around identity politics has something to do with the loss of a dream of secular emancipation, which was born with the French Revolution and arguably died in 1989 to 1991. I think that moment is important. The Chinese-Soviet comparison is fascinating, and we ought to be doing a lot more of that systematic comparison. I agree with you that there were internal frustrations within the Soviet Empire, both within its colonies and within its own country. But it's not the path of declining empires to disassemble themselves in the way in which the Soviet Empire did. Historically, these empires tend to hang on as long as they can. The more common route is to do what the Chinese did when democracy and the turn toward democracy and capitalism weren't working in tandem. They repressed democracy and embraced capitalism. I think we have to ask more whether that option was open to the Soviet Union at that point, whether they might have had a Chinese option. In other words, deciding against democracy, choosing to preserve their empire rather than disassembling it. Perry Anderson is one of the few people I've read who's done a systematic comparison of those two communist empires, says no, that internally the structure of those societies was so different. That helps us understand why China went its way and the Soviet Union went its way. But I think we do have to ask the question whether the Soviet Union was destined to disappear in the period 1989 to 1991. And if we situate that empire in the broader history of empires, I think our answer to that has to be no, it did not have to disappear at that moment. There were other alternatives available to it. And I don't think the people power of Europe would have been strong enough had the Soviet Union decided to deploy its military muscle as it had in the past. Your last questions have to do with where we're moving now. I think I may hesitate to answer those just because that's going to lead to another monologue, and I'm inclined to save some time for questions from the audience. But let me just say very briefly about if we're moving away from a neoliberal order, are we moving toward a multipolar world? I think the answer to that is quite possibly yes. I think we may be living through the end of Pax Americana, which has dominated international politics for 50 years, much as Pax Britannica dominated the global world of the second half of the 19th century and the first years of the 20th century. We may be living through a similar transition now. And especially as globalization is in retreat, opposition to free trade is mounting, opposition to the free movement of people, the free movement of capital, the free movement of information, things that were essential to the neoliberal order during their heyday. It seems to me that quite possibly what might come out of this moment of transition, and of course, Russia's attack on Ukraine is very much a part of this, is a multipolar world composed of several blocks, the United States being one block, China being another, Russia being a third, Europe being a fourth, perhaps. And then we have to deal also with South Asia as well, and what's going to come out of that. I think one of the really interesting questions, and I can't answer it, you're much better placed to answer it than I am, is whether this revival of the West that is going on now in response to Ukraine is going to lead to a reinvigoration of NATO and the post-war alliance during its heyday, or whether, and this is what I think your question was pushing me toward, whether there's going to be a divergence now between the United States and Europe, that the blocks that are emerging it won't be the same kind of European American bloc that characterized NATO during its heyday, but that there is going to be a growing divergence between Europe and the United States. And that fits the model of the world moving toward a multipolar configuration that's going to look quite different from either the Cold War or the unipolar moment that the United States enjoyed during its neoliberal heyday. So it's not really an answer to your question, but it's asking the right question about the future. And I think it's quite possible that the configuration of American and European relations in the next 20 years will look very different from the period of American-European relations, say from 1945 through the 1980s.
Thank you. We're now opening it up to the audience. We have a number of people with hands raised. Reeve Houston has been waiting patiently. Reeve, if you would unmute yourself, you may pose a question.
Hi, Gary. Thank you for your talk. Really, really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I guess of course, I have six questions to ask, and I'm going to try and keep it to one, which is, you seem to be building on David Harvey in defining neoliberalism as a policy project. But one part of that, if I remember Harvey correctly, was that it was a policy project in the service of reinvigorating, getting a more sort of robust process of capital accumulation going. And in my mind, at least, and maybe Harvey talks about this, that involves a whole bunch of new business strategies and models for making money. Financialization being the really big one. But I'm just wondering, does your book, or can you talk about on the relationship between new business strategies, new models for capital accumulation, and the kinds of policy regimes we have seen between Reagan and Clinton, for example? And that's it.
And I'm just going to weigh in for 1 second and use the heavy hand of the monitor to say we have lots of people with questions. So if we could keep the questions and the responses on the more succinct side, we can get to more people.
Financialization is and the kind of capital accumulation that is generating is a primary technique, Reeve, for that. The story I tell of the 1990s is the convergence of two politicians who hate each other, Gingrich and Clinton, around a common program of political economy that one sees emerging through the telecommunications reform bill that virtually removes all public regulations from the telecom industry, that then leads to the deregulation of Wall Street and the exclusion of derivatives from all sorts of regulation in one area after another. The free market is being installed by Democrats as much as by Republicans, and it's also benefiting from the utopianism of the internet moment, which peaks in the 1990s, and a sense of a new industry with all kinds of wondrous possibilities, and the emergence of Silicon Valley as a center for venture capitalism, and the marriage of Silicon Valley and Wall Street under the auspices of the Democratic Party in the 1990s. That's all a central part of the story that I tell, and that opens up possibilities for enormous capital accumulation, as does the continuing destruction of the labor movement and the weakening of the labor movement to the point where the private sector labor movement has in its ranks a smaller percentage of people than it had on the eve of the Great Depression, which we always thought of as a nadir of organized labor in America that would never be repeated. So it's partly what business is doing to open up its possibilities for accumulation, and it's partly the destruction of the forces that had been opposed to those levels of accumulation, which create all kinds of new possibilities for growth, capitalist enterprise, and wealth, leading to very deepening inequality, which simply accelerates dramatically across the 1990s.
Thank you. Dan Letwin, unmute yourself and pose a brief question.
All right. Thank you so much for this really stimulating talk. And I was particularly intrigued by your discussion of the competing neo-populisms of the left and the right that kind of rush in to fill the vacuum left with the implosion of the neoliberal order. And so my question is, I guess, really an instrumental one. It's not the burden of a historian to provide guidance on how a resurgent left might optimize its prospects in America. But if you were to be asked, what lessons might kind of the Sanders-style left take from your findings as it seeks to achieve what might be called the new social democratic order?
Thanks, Dan. It's great. It's a great question. I document pretty fully the revival of the left in the 2010s. That's part of the story of the breakup of neoliberal hegemony. It opens up space that had not been there before. And I consider Bernie Sanders, and I say so in the book, to be the second most successful socialist in all of American history. He's living in our time, second only to Eugene Victor Debs. I also think that the rapprochement between the center of the Democratic Party and the left of the Democratic Party went further in the last 5 years than in any time since the 1930s and 40s. I think one of Biden's strengths, and in this moment of weakness, it's important to remember he had some significant strengths. One of his strengths was to, I think, grasp this as an inflection moment, and that the politics of Obama and Clinton era could not simply be restored. That one had to think in new ways, fresh ways with new ideas, fresh alliances, and that included an opening to the left. Of course, most of the left project, as it was imagined, is now failing. And I think that has to do with the razor thin margins with which the Democrats are operating in Washington. And I think the progressives got a little ahead of themselves in terms of feeling their power. The Democratic Party opened their arms to them, but the Democratic Party opened their arms to them more than the American people opened their arms to them. And if the left is going to be successful, as I think you would like it to be, it's going to have to find a way of building a electoral constituency that is stronger than the one that it has now, which means moving beyond the coasts and big metropolitan cities and recapturing something that was lost when the South abandoned the Democratic Party, which is the Democratic Party, in a sense, had to abandon the South in order to forward the project of civil rights. It was necessary. But what the South gave the Democratic Party electorally was a base in rural and small town America, which I would say it has never successfully replaced. And given the structure of American politics and the structure of the Electoral College and the weight of American politics toward rural areas, small towns, I think 30% of the population elects 70% of the senators. That's a reality of American politics. The left is going to have to find a way to build itself in places where it currently is not strong. The labor movement might provide some of that, but also the Republicans understand much better than the Democrats do the need to struggle at every level of American politics, beginning with who's got to represent our voices on the local PTA. The left would much rather come hear a lecture by an academic than go to the PTA and try and take it over. In that respect, I think the Republican Party understands the intense localism of American politics better than the left does. And that's a lesson I think that has still to be learned.
Thank you. Melvin Dubofsky, if you would unmute yourself, you can pose a brief question. Welcome, Mel.
Gary, it's been
Yes.
quite a while since I've been anywhere with you, and I haven't had the opportunity to read your book. But I wonder, in thinking about your subject, did you pay any attention to the work of Giovanni Arrighi on how capitalism has changed in the contemporary world and how he's looked at the changes in the Soviet Union and the PRC? I think his work is really brilliant. And I still remember the evening, midnight in Red Square, 1981, when he predicted that the Soviet Communist Party and the Soviet Union would be dead within 10 years. So I'm just wondering, have you made any use of his work?
I have not, but Mel, it's great to hear from you after all these years. And whenever I encounter you, I always learn something new. So you've taught me that I'm going to have to think about that. I read other people who are trying to contemplate the future of capitalism, like Wilfred Streeck, and I think the question is very important. And if Arrighi did predict that in 1979. He was almost the only one who did, because what remains stunning to me about the moment of the Soviet Union's collapse is that almost no one in who I know, who I was reading in the United States or Europe, predicted it. It came as a tremendous shock, and part of what the book tries to recover is the shocking nature of that moment, which is one reason why I accord it so much importance as a turning point. But I will set myself to reading Arrighi, and because I think part of the point of the book is to say that capitalism is a ceaselessly restless dynamic system that is always reinventing itself. And part of the limitation of some of the work on neoliberalism is that it imagines this as a permanent regime of capitalism, whereas I see it as a passing phase of capitalism. Capitalism has reinvented itself many times and will again in ways that perhaps will have very little to do with the forms of neoliberal reason and politics that have dominated the last 50 years.
Thank you. We have time for one last question, and Barbara Gubin will get in the last word if she unmutes herself and poses the question. Welcome, Barbara. We are waiting for the unmuting. All right, then. Let's see if Brett Rini gets in the last word this time. Sorry about that, Barbara. Brett, unmute, please. Hello?
Question.
Yes.
I didn't actually have a question, but
Oh.
I appreciate the discussion.
There was a hand up for a long time. Then finally,
Sorry
Michael
about that.
Hillard. Michael?
Okay, I just got the unmute button.
Thank you.
Yes, here's my question. Is it valuable to, and does the research support focusing specifically on the segments of capital in ascendance and decline at the time of neoliberalism's rise, and the specific roles these segments played in shaping the political project of neoliberalism, specifically the decline, at least in the US, of industrial capital and the rise of mercantile and financial capital, and with a lag, tech capital?
Yes, absolutely. And one of the strengths of the rise and fall of the New Deal order was the way in which some of the contributors to that collection were able to get beyond generalizations about capital and understand which portions of capital were rising and which were falling, and the divisions in the ranks of capitalists themselves, and why some capitalists, groups of capitalists, would choose to ally themselves with the New Deal, and other groups were steadfast opponents to it to the very bitter end. And I think that's an important approach to carry over into a study of the neoliberal order. And I certainly highlight in the book the troubled character of industrial capital and the tremendous rise of finance capital. And I also particularly highlight the high-tech revolution of the 1990s and the invention of a new sector of business, which now has the largest corporations in the world, well beyond the size of General Motors and the titans of, and even the retail giants, the titans of an earlier era. And it speaks to the importance of divisions within capital and certain new vanguards of capital, and pushing forward new constellations of relationships between politics and the economy. I also just want to say, by way of conclusion, that if we are moving into a new political order, or a period of disorder that will lead at some point to a new political order, it's incumbent upon us to look at divisions once again in the ranks of capitalists, and to imagine what new forces within capital may be rising and which falling, and which sectors of capital were most instrumental in supporting Trump. We know some of them, but not all of them. And which sectors of capital are most beholden to McConnell and the other segment of the Republican Party. So that kind of analysis I haven't done, but I think it's a project that's very, very important for students of the contemporary political economy in America to undertake. And I want to put in another plug for Melinda Cooper and her work, because she's beginning to do some of this work, and also imagining Trump as a proprietary rather than a corporate capitalist. And we might also, in a way, fit the Koch brothers under this umbrella. And it may be that part of the configuration of politics now has to do with the division between corporate and proprietary capitalists. And it's worth pursuing that insight to see what implications that have for the political world that is being convulsed and transformed as we speak.
Thank you. I unfortunately have to draw this to a close. I think we could go on for at least another hour. We have another hand, and I have, 18 questions opened up on the Q&A. But let me assure folks in the audience that we've only scratched the surface of this book. As Gary mentioned at the beginning, it's also a narrative history of our times. So there's a lot more in its pages than what we've been able to touch upon today. And I think it would people would benefit from engaging in its narrative and in its argument. I want to thank Lisbeth, Christina, Gary, and Christian for this session today, along with those of you in the audience who have been with us since 4 o'clock. And with that, I turn this back to Christian for the final words.
Thanks, Eric. Every now and then I have these moments when I can't believe somebody is actually paying me a salary to do this. Tonight, I had one of those moments. Thank you, Gary, Lisbeth, Christina, and of course, Eric, for really, truly learned and amazing discussion. I enjoyed it. Please join us next week for Counterterrorism Between the Wars in International History, Monday, 4 p.m., Washington History Seminar. Thanks again. We're adjourned. Stay safe and good night.